Isaac, a man with unshakable faith, deeply understood the power of prayer. He knew that his life and future were in God's hands. So when Rebekah couldn't have children, he didn't hesitate. He got on his knees and sought the Lord. Picture this: a man in the middle of the desert, surrounded by the stillness of the night, pouring out his heart in desperate prayer. His prayer wasn't just a simple request. It was a heartfelt cry, filled with hope and perseverance. How many times in life do we face situations that feel impossible, where the only way forward is to seek God with all our hearts? Rebekah, on the other hand, dealt with a struggle many women can relate to. She felt the heavy weight of being childless in a society that saw motherhood as a direct blessing from God. Even so, she trusted her husband and the power of faith. But when she finally became pregnant, something unusual happened. A deep discomfort overtook her. It was more than physical, it felt spiritual. At that moment, Rebekah also turned to God, and he revealed something extraordinary to her. God's response to Rebekah was clear and prophetic. She was carrying twins. But these weren't just babies. They were two nations within her womb. More than that, the natural order would be reversed. The older would serve the younger. This wasn't a common revelation. It was a profound glimpse into God's purpose. Sometimes God gives us a vision of the future, but doesn't provide all the details. How do you respond when God reveals something amazing, but doesn't hand over the full manual? It's interesting to see how Isaac and Rebekah complemented each other during this journey. While Isaac showed steadfast faith, Rebekah was more practical and questioning. This dynamic can be seen in many couples facing challenges together. They both sought God, but each in their own way. It's a reminder that God values our uniqueness as we draw closer to Him. Isaac and Rebekah's story teaches us the power of persistence in prayer. Often, God doesn't respond immediately, but that doesn't mean He's not listening. The Bible is full of examples of men and women who waited patiently for God's intervention. Think of Abraham, Isaac's own father, who waited years for the promise of a son. These stories show us that God's timing is perfect, even if we don't always understand it. When Rebekah felt discomfort during her pregnancy, she set an important example. Instead of relying solely on her intuition or human advice, she sought God. How often do we find ourselves in uncomfortable situations and look for answers in all the wrong places? Maybe the key is learning to hear God's voice amid the chaos. Another fascinating point in this story is how God's plans often defy our expectations. Who would have thought the younger son would prevail over the older one? It teaches us that God's logic doesn't follow human patterns. He chooses the unlikely, the humble, the ones the world might overlook. Are you underestimating what God can do in your life? God's revelation about Rebekah's sons also highlights a recurring biblical theme: the tension between the flesh and the spirit, the immediate and the eternal. While one son would seek to satisfy fleeting desires, the other would grasp the bigger picture of God's purpose. It's a challenge for us too. Are we living for the now or for what God has planned for us? Moreover, Isaac's prayer shows that interceding for those we love is one of the greatest acts of love. He didn't give up on Rebekah or blame her condition. Instead, he sought God on her behalf. What does this teach us about our relationships? Are we praying enough for the people around us? This story is also a powerful reminder that God is always at work, even when we can't see it. He heard Isaac's prayers, answered Rebekah's cry, and had already mapped out the future of their children. And so, the narrative moves toward the birth of two boys who would each in their own way change the course of history. When the big day finally arrived, Rebekah gave birth to two boys who couldn't have been more different from one another. Esau, the firstborn, came out red and covered in hair, a feature that made him stand out from the get-go. Jacob, on the Other hand followed right behind, grasping Esau's heel as if he was determined not to be left behind. That detail wasn't just a quirky fact, it was a hint of what was to come. Isn't it funny how, in life, the first steps of a journey can sometimes foreshadow what lies ahead? Esau grew up as someone totally in tune with the natural world. He was a skilled hunter, a man who knew how to thrive in the toughest conditions. His bold and decisive personality made him Isaac's favorite. Isaac admired his independence and practical skills. Jacob, on the flip side, was more reserved, preferring the quieter life close to home. He had a thoughtful, introspective nature, which allowed him to observe and learn before making his moves. These differences remind us that even siblings can take completely different paths in life. It's impossible to talk about the birth of these two without touching on the competition that seemed to be born right alongside them. Even in the womb, there was tension between Esau and Jacob, something that would shape their choices and destinies. This rivalry is a reminder that some of life's biggest lessons come from the challenges we face within our own families. Have you ever stopped to think about how your closest relationships have shaped the person you are today? Esau and Jacob represent two very different kinds of people. While Esau lived in the moment, chasing instant gratification, Jacob had his eyes on the future, carefully planning every step. This fundamental difference teaches us an important lesson about how we approach life. Are you more like Esau, living for the here and now, or like Jacob, always strategizing for what's ahead? The birth scene also highlights how God had a plan for both brothers from the very beginning. Even though Esau was the firstborn, the traditions of the time would be overturned by a greater purpose. God often disrupts human expectations to fulfill his will. Maybe that's why things don't always go according to our plans. Isn't it comforting to know there's a bigger purpose behind it all? Rebecca must have felt the weight of this duality as she watched her sons grow up. As a mother, she knew about the prophecy, but she also saw how their differences became more pronounced over time. It's a struggle many parents face, balancing unconditional love for their children with the understanding that each one is on a unique and sometimes conflicting path. That realization might help us better understand our own family dynamics. Over the years, Esau and Jacob continued to live according to their distinct natures. Esau, with his physical strength and practical skills, earned the respect of many, but was often led by his impulses. Jacob, on the other hand, developed emotional intelligence and strategic thinking that would prove critical in pivotal moments. Isn't it fascinating how these traits still define how people tackle challenges today? The Bible presents this story, not just as a historical account, but as a wellspring of deep reflections. The way Esau and Jacob's lives began already hinted at their unique roles in God's plan. It makes you wonder, are we paying attention to the signs God gives us about our own purpose? The relationship between these brothers is a mirror for many of us. How often have we felt like we're competing with someone close to us? That struggle can teach us so much about who we are and how we deal with our insecurities. After all, finding balance between accepting ourselves and striving to improve isn't easy. And so, the birth of Esau and Jacob marked the beginning of a story that would transcend generations. Their differences weren't just physical or behavioral, they were spiritual and prophetic. While the world's focus might have been on the stronger, older brother, God was already crafting a narrative that would elevate the unexpected. But the real transformation was still ahead, with events that would test not just Jacob's faith, but also his character and determination. From the start, it was pretty clear that Isaac and Rebekah had distinct preferences when it came to their sons, something that would deeply influence their family dynamic. Isaac, a man of simple habits who valued practical skills, naturally gravitated toward Esau, his firstborn and a skilled hunter. Esau embodied everything Isaac admired: strength, fearlessness, and the ability to provide with his own hands. Rebekah, on the other hand, with her contemplative nature and deep understanding of God's promise, felt a stronger connection to Jacob. His calm and introspective temperament seemed to align better with her worldview. But let's be honest, how rare is favoritism in families, really? The Bible doesn't shy away from showing how this favoritism played out. It's almost like the story nudges us to think about our own choices within our families. Do we, as parents, tend to favor the traits that reflect us, or do we value qualities we aspire to? That kind of preference might seem subtle, but its ripple effects are enormous. In Esau and Jacob's case, it didn't just spark competition. It created a clear divide in the household, something many of us might have witnessed in our own lives. Picture this: Esau coming home after a long day of hunting, greeted with pride and enthusiasm by Isaac. Meanwhile, Jacob sits with Rebekah, learning about family traditions and listening to stories about the God of Abraham. Both received love, but the way that love was expressed couldn't have been more different. And honestly, isn't it fascinating how the little things we do daily can leave such a lasting impact? It's worth noting that this favoritism wasn't just about personal preferences. It was deeply tied to how Isaac and Rebekah viewed their sons' futures. Isaac saw Esau as the natural heir, someone who could carry on his legacy. Rebekah, however, clung to God's prophecy that the younger would prevail over the older. This tension between them didn't just shape how they related to their sons. It also influenced how the boys saw the world and their place in it. Parental favoritism reminds us that we all carry expectations for the people we love. Whether it's a father hoping his son will follow in his footsteps, or a mother wishing her daughter would forge a path different from her own, these expectations can be both a guide and a burden. And when those expectations aren't balanced with love and understanding, the consequences can be painful. For Esau and Jacob, these preferences not only shaped who they became, but also impacted the choices they made. Esau, for instance, might have felt that his worth was tied to what he could do and provide. Jacob, on the other hand, probably grew up thinking he had to be clever and strategic to get ahead, since his natural position didn't guarantee him any privileges. Do you think this mindset played a role in how they tackled challenges later? And it's interesting to see how the theme of favoritism pops up again and again in the Bible and even in our lives today. Think about Joseph and his brothers, or stories from modern families. Favoritism doesn't just divide, it breeds resentment. And you can see that so clearly in Esau and Jacob's story. Are there practical ways we can avoid this in our own families? 1. Takeaway from this story is the importance of recognizing the uniqueness of every individual in the family. While Isaac and Rebekah had their preferences, maybe making more of an effort to balance their love and support could have prevented a lot of the conflicts that arose. After all, God created us all uniquely, and it's that diversity that makes our families and communities so rich. For readers today, parental favoritism is a challenge to reflect on. Are we valuing everyone around us equally? As parents, friends, or partners, are we showing love in ways that make everyone feel included and appreciated? The answers to these questions can shape not only our relationships, but also the legacy we leave behind. So as Isaac and Rebekah navigated the complexities of favoritism, the story of their sons continued to unfold. And while Esau and Jacob went down very different paths, the impact of their parents' choices would echo for generations. But how would those choices shape the events to come? The story is just getting started. Esau was a straightforward, impulsive guy, a man who lived in the moment, rarely stopping to think about the long-term consequences of his choices. After a grueling day of hunting, he came home completely exhausted, starving, and on the verge of collapse. And that's when he stumbled upon Jacob, who was cooking up a pot of deliciously fragrant red stew. Without any hesitation, Esau blurted out, "Quick, give me some of that stew. I'm about to die." Jacob, ever the opportunist and always thinking ahead, saw this as the perfect moment to score something big, Esau's birthright. He wasted no time and replied bluntly, "First, sell me your birthright." Overwhelmed by hunger and unable to grasp the long-term stakes, Esau dismissed the importance of his position as the firstborn. "What good is a birthright to me if I'm starving to death?" he snapped, agreeing to the trade without a second thought. That exchange between the brothers wasn't just a simple deal. It was a symbolic moment that revealed the fundamental differences between them. Esau was willing to give up something of eternal value for instant gratification, while Jacob, though not exactly noble in his methods, was thinking strategically about the future. This story makes us pause and ask, how many times in our own lives do we sacrifice something truly important for a fleeting moment of satisfaction or to solve a temporary problem? In the culture of that time, the birthright wasn't just about material inheritance. It carried spiritual significance and the honor of being the successor to God's covenant with Abraham. By trading his birthright for a bowl of stew, Esau showed his inability to value what truly mattered. It's a powerful reminder. Are we cherishing the blessings and responsibilities God has entrusted to us, or are we swapping the eternal for the immediate? Jacob, while clever and determined, acted in a way that could easily be seen as opportunistic. He took advantage of his brother's weakness to serve his own goals, showing that his methods didn't always align with the moral values that would later shape his spiritual journey. This reminds us that God works through imperfect people, often using their flaws to accomplish his greater plans. Jacob still had a lot to learn about character and faith. Esau, on the other hand, teaches us the importance of recognizing what's truly valuable. By saying yes to a fleeting desire, he effectively said no to a greater purpose. This is something we see often in our own lives, times when we trade our dreams, promises, or faith for something that feels urgent but is ultimately temporary. What are the red stews in your life? What fleeting pleasures or quick fixes are causing you to overlook God's bigger plans for you? This story also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of impulsive decisions. Esau acted on emotion, driven by immediate needs, without considering the long-term fallout. How often do we make similar choices? Whether it's spending money we don't have, making hasty career decisions, or giving in to momentary desires, only to regret it later when the consequences hit. Esau's choice had lasting consequences. In that moment, he didn't realize it, but his decision would define his future and distance him from the divine plan reserved for the firstborn. Jacob, meanwhile, became the heir to the promise, but not without facing his own set of challenges. This story reminds us that the choices we make today impact not only our present, but also our future. The story of Esau and Jacob invites us to reflect on our own priorities. Are we focused on what's eternal and truly meaningful, or are we letting ourselves be swept away by what's convenient right now? Maybe the answer lies in trusting God more and relying less on our fleeting emotions, seeking wisdom to make choices that align with his plans for us. So, while Esau chose the path of immediate gratification, Jacob took a step toward fulfilling God's promises, flawed though his methods may have been. But this story is far from over. The consequences of that birthright trade would test not only their family bonds, but also the character and resilience of each brother. What happens? Next we'll reveal even more about their journey and ours. The relationship between Esau and Jacob, already marked by rivalry, hit its breaking point during the infamous deception over Isaac's blessing. In Hebrew culture, it was tradition for a father, nearing the end of his life, to give a special blessing to his firstborn, a blessing that symbolized prosperity, leadership, and the continuation of the family's spiritual legacy. Esau, as the eldest, was the natural heir to this blessing. However, Rebekah, knowing the prophecy that the younger would prevail over the older, devised a plan to ensure Jacob received it instead. Isaac, now old and nearly blind, called Esau and asked him to hunt and prepare a special meal, promising to bless him afterward. Little did he know that Rebekah was eavesdropping. Determined to carry out what she believed was God's plan, she quickly instructed Jacob to pose as Esau. The scene that unfolded was packed with tension. Jacob, hesitant and afraid of being caught, voiced his concerns, but Rebekah reassured him, taking full responsibility for the consequences. With goat skins to mimic Esau's hairy skin and wearing his brother's clothes, Jacob presented the meal to Isaac, pretending to be the firstborn. Isaac, suspicious, questioned the speed of the hunt and the voice that didn't quite match Esau's, but he was ultimately convinced by the smell of the clothing and the feel of the skin. In the end, Isaac bestowed the blessing meant for Esau upon Jacob, sealing his future with words of prosperity and authority. When Esau returned with the meal Isaac had requested, the truth came to light. Esau's reaction was one of deep anguish, a mix of betrayal and irreparable loss. He begged his father for any remaining blessing, but Isaac explained that the blessing had already been given and couldn't be undone. Consumed by rage, Esau vowed to kill Jacob as soon as the mourning period for Isaac was over. That oath of vengeance stands as a stark warning about the weight of impulsive decisions and unresolved hurt. Rebekah, hearing of Esau's threat, stepped in once again. She persuaded Isaac to send Jacob to their relatives in Haran, under the pretense of finding a wife from their own lineage rather than marrying a Canaanite woman. While practical, this decision also underscored the cost of her actions, the separation of her family and Jacob's exile. Jacob and Rebekah's deception, though seemingly successful, left a trail of consequences that rippled through their family. Jacob fled for his life, leaving behind a resentful brother, a deceived father, and a mother who would never see him again. This story reminds us that even when we align with God's plan, the methods we choose have lasting impacts. Do we trust God enough to wait on His timing, or do we try to force outcomes on our own terms? This story also challenges us to think about the importance of integrity in our actions. While Jacob achieved his desired goal, the cost was steep. He spent years as a stranger in a foreign land, facing trials that would shape his character. Sometimes the choices we make to reach our goals end up costing far more than we anticipate. What price are we willing to pay for what we want? Esau's pain, on the other hand, highlights how intense emotions can lead to rash decisions. His hatred for Jacob was understandable, but his vow of revenge revealed his inability to process his loss constructively. This dynamic is a powerful reflection of how unresolved anger and bitterness can destroy relationships and pull us further away from our purpose. Rebekah, who initially seemed wise and strategic, also bore the consequences of her actions. In protecting Jacob, she lost the chance to be with him, spending the rest of her life separated from the son she loved so dearly. Her story shows us that even the best-laid plans, when executed through questionable means, can lead to bitter outcomes. This episode serves as a powerful reminder that God works even through our flaws and conflicts. Despite the deception and family divisions, His plan for Jacob remained intact. God would use Jacob's experiences in Haran to transform him and prepare him for what lay ahead. But how would this transformation unfold? The next chapter of Jacob's life would be a true test of faith and character. After losing both his birthright and Isaac's blessing, Esau's relationship with his family took an even sharper turn for the worse. Bitter and resentful, his choices seemed like a deliberate challenge to the family's values. The Bible tells us that Esau married Hittite women from the land of Canaan, going directly against the traditions and wishes of his parents. This wasn't just a personal decision, it was a bold statement of independence, one that brought grief and bitterness to Isaac and Rebekah. Esau's choice of Hittite wives, contrary to what he might have hoped, didn't help repair his relationship with his parents. Instead, these marriages created tension and heartache, a constant reminder of how his decisions clashed with the family's principles. It's a sobering thought. How often do our choices, especially in relationships, affect not just us, but those around us? Are we making decisions rooted in our values, or are we simply reacting to our circumstances? Esau's decision to marry Canaanite women also reveals a pattern of impulsive behavior. Instead of seeking God's guidance or considering his family's advice, he acted on his desires in the moment. This is a cautionary tale about the long-lasting consequences of unreflective decisions. How often do we rush into something without pausing to think about how it might shape our future? Years later, realizing how displeased his parents were with his Canaanite wives, Esau attempted to make amends. He married a daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, hoping to win Isaac and Rebekah's approval. But even this well-meaning decision couldn't erase the damage caused by his earlier choices. This attempt at reconciliation reminds us that while we can work to fix our mistakes, the consequences of past actions don't always disappear. Esau's search for validation through his marriage choices missed a critical point. Reconciliation with his family required more than outward actions. He needed to address the anger and bitterness he felt toward Jacob and the frustrations he'd carried for years. This teaches us that true change starts within. External gestures might patch things up temporarily, but lasting transformation comes from addressing what's in our hearts. Interestingly, despite his poor choices and failures, Esau was still blessed by God in material ways. He became a powerful man, with wealth and a large family. This shows that even when we stray, God's grace can still bring opportunities for success. However, material blessings don't erase the spiritual and emotional consequences of our decisions. Esau's Hittite and Ishmaelite wives also symbolize how the relationships we choose can either draw us closer to or pull us further from our purpose. These women represented cultural influences that didn't align with God's covenant with Abraham's family. Similarly, the relationships we cultivate in our lives can shape our spiritual journey, for better or for worse. Esau's attempt to please his parents by marrying into Ishmael's lineage also serves as a reminder that we often look for external fixes to problems that require internal resolution. He needed reconciliation with God and his family, but instead he sought a shortcut. It makes us wonder, are we addressing the root of our problems, or are we just putting band-aids on the symptoms? Despite Esau's failures, the Bible doesn't paint him as a villain. He's a deeply human character with strengths and weaknesses that reflect all of us. His story is a powerful reminder of how impulsive choices can pull us away from our purpose, but it's also a testament to God's grace working in our lives, even when we mess up. Esau's story leaves us with an important lesson. Our decisions don't just affect us, they ripple out to those around us. What might seem like a purely personal choice can become a source of family conflict and pain. Still, Esau's narrative wasn't over yet. There was more to come. He and Jacob still had unfinished business, and the possibility of reconciliation lingered as a promise on the horizon. What would happen when these two brothers finally met again after all those years? After years of separation, Jacob and Esau finally came face to face again. Jacob's journey to this moment had been anything but easy, filled with challenges and personal transformation. He had faced his own flaws, endured deceit, and had a life-changing encounter with God that gave him a new identity, Israel. Yet his greatest test was still ahead, facing the brother who had once vowed to kill him. Jacob knew that reconciliation would require humility, and he began with a symbolic gesture, sending gifts to Esau to soothe his anger. Esau, meanwhile, had gone through his own changes. Though the Bible doesn't detail how he processed the past, his actions during the reunion spoke volumes. When the brothers met, Esau ran to embrace Jacob, showing a spirit of forgiveness that caught everyone off guard. This powerful moment reminds us that reconciliation is possible even in relationships scarred by deep wounds. Jacob's attitude during the reunion was one of complete humility. He bowed to the ground 7 times before Esau, acknowledging his wrongdoing and seeking to restore peace. This wasn't just a cultural gesture, it was a profound act of repentance and respect. How often, in our own conflicts, do we hesitate to humble ourselves and ask for forgiveness? Jacob teaches us that reconciliation starts with the willingness to own up to our mistakes. Esau's response, accepting Jacob without demanding anything in return, offers a beautiful example of true forgiveness. He didn't bring up the stolen blessing or try to reclaim what he had lost. Instead, he chose to prioritize their family bond over past grievances. This act challenges us to consider whether we're holding on to grudges that we could let go of. After all, forgiveness isn't just a gift to the person we forgive, it's also a gift to ourselves. Even though forgiveness was extended, it's worth noting that Jacob and Esau went their separate ways after the reunion. They led distinct lives, with Esau establishing his lineage as the Edomites, a nation that would often clash with Israel. This highlights an important truth. Reconciliation doesn't always mean staying closely connected. Sometimes making peace means accepting that each person will walk their own path. The legacy of Esau and Jacob is deeply symbolic. Esau, despite his earlier impulsiveness, became a respected figure with a strong and prosperous people. Jacob, on the other hand, became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, fulfilling God's promise to Abraham. Both played significant roles in history, showing that God can use even our failures and conflicts to achieve his purposes. Reconciliation also points to something greater, God's ability to restore relationships that seem beyond repair. Despite the pain between the brothers, their moment of forgiveness offered a glimpse of divine redemption. This challenges us to view the conflicts in our own lives with hope, knowing that nothing is impossible for God. The story of these brothers also underscores how our actions ripple into future generations. The conflicts between Israel and Edom, their descendants, illustrate how unresolved issues can persist over time. But their reunion serves as a reminder that deliberate choices for reconciliation can create a positive legacy for those who come after us. The reunion between Esau and Jacob is one of the most moving scenes in the Bible because it captures the essence of mercy and grace. It reminds us that no matter how distant we may feel from our brothers, whether literally or metaphorically, there's always an opportunity for a fresh start. This moment inspires us to keep striving for peace, even when it feels out of reach. And so, the story of Esau and Jacob reaches a resolution, though not a final conclusion. The brothers went their separate ways, leaving behind a legacy of both conflict and reconciliation that would outlive them. Their story challenges us to reflect on our own relationships and ask, are we willing to pursue peace and forgiveness, no matter the cost? In the end, reconciliation might just be the greatest legacy we can leave behind. After everything we've seen about Esau, his choices, and his role in the biblical narrative, the big question is, how do we apply these lessons to our own lives? Esau teaches us that impulsiveness and a disregard for what's sacred can pull us away from God's purpose for us. His decisions were shaped by the moment, but their consequences echoed for generations. Now take a moment to reflect. Are you valuing the things that truly matter? Are you living with purpose, or just getting caught up in the demands of the here and now? Maybe it's time to reassess your priorities and seek God's wisdom to make choices that honor not just the present, but also your future. Esau's story isn't just about loss, it's also about grace. Even in the midst of mistakes, God is still at work. He gives us opportunities to start over, seek reconciliation, and realign our lives with His plan. So what will your next choice be? Are you ready to set aside the pull of instant gratification and trust in God's timing? These questions might feel a little uncomfortable, but they're so important. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Esau's story spoke to you the most? And hey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like. That way, you won't miss any content that'll inspire and transform the way you see the Bible and life itself. Oh, and don't go anywhere just yet. There's another amazing video on the screen right now that you're going to love. See you in the next video.